Welcome to the Resilient Performance Podcast. I'm your host, Doug Kachijan, and today I'm joined by Dave Durante. Dave is a multiple-time USA Gymnastics national champion and was part of the 2008 Beijing Olympic team as an alternate. After retiring from competition, Dave helped coach his alma mater, Stanford University, to an NCAA team title in 2009 and has continued to be a part of the sport through his position on the Athletic Advisory Committee with the United States Olympic Committee, as well as his position on the USA Gymnastics Men's Program Committee. Dave leads Team Power Monkey, which is comprised of elite athletes and coaches who help design new equipment, provide gymnastics education to the fitness world, and coach at Power Monkey's biannual training camp. Dave was the lead coach with the CrossFit Gymnastics Level 1 course from 2013 to 2015. He also wrote and developed the CrossFit Gymnastics Advanced course. He lives in New York City with his wife, Sadie, and coaches at Solace, New York. Dave and I covered quite a few topics to include the mental side of elite performance, and also Dave revealed quite a bit about his personal weaknesses as an athlete and how he overcame those weaknesses. So I think you'll all enjoy Dave's perspective in those areas.
Dave, thanks so much for joining us. Appreciate your taking the time to do this. I was wondering if you could begin by just telling us a little bit about your competitive athletic background and then how you transitioned into being a coach.
Yeah, sure. Doug, it's a pleasure to be here. I appreciate you having me on. So I've been doing gymnastics for over 30 years now in some capacity. I started out in New Jersey, going into a club gym there when I was 6 years old. I kind of went through the ranks in the club program and was fortunate enough to get a scholarship to Stanford University. So I went from the East Coast all the way to the West, and I was a part of Stanford's team for my college years. When I finished, I was kind of at a transition period in my gymnastics career, deciding whether or not I wanted to continue forward. At that point, I had been kind of a good college gymnast, but hadn't really transitioned to being one of the bigger guys on the USA or international scene. I then ended up making a U.S. national team for the first time during my fifth year at Stanford, and that kind of snowballed into me becoming a bigger part of Team USA, and that led to me being, captain of the team for a number of years, and I ended up being part of Team USA for 6 years. During that time, I had moved to the Olympic Training Center in Colorado Springs, and I lived there for 4.5 years as I trained for the 2008 Beijing Olympic Games. Was national champion a few times, and was alternate for the team in Beijing that went out to China. And then after I retired in 2008, I was trying to figure out what I wanted to do next. And the Stanford coach asked if I wanted to come on board as one of the assistant coaches. And I thought it was a good time for me to kind of figure out what I wanted to do. I knew that coaching a college team was kind of on the periphery. It wasn't really at the forefront of my mind at the time, but I wanted to try to win a national championship because I wasn't able to do it as an athlete at Stanford. So fortunately, we ended up winning a national championship in 2009, first one in 14 years for Stanford. So I was able to get my NCAA ring. And then I left Stanford after that year. I'd only signed a 1-year contract, and I moved to Italy and actually had aspirations to potentially get into the wine business. I have dual citizenship with Italy, and was living out there for a little while. Most of my family lives out there, and I had an unfortunate occurrence happen visiting some gymnastics friends in Austria. I went skiing for the first time and blew out my knee in the first 5 minutes of a ski run in Innsbruck, Austria, and ended up having to have surgery in Italy, and had my knee repaired. And during that recovery, I started coaching at a gymnastics gym in Rome, and it kind of started me on this path to gymnastics coaching. It was kind of an odd way to get into it again. But from there, I moved back to the States, and it kind of snowballed into something bigger and bigger. Power Monkey is kind of a different story that we can potentially get into, but from there, so honestly, like a knee injury skiing kind of led me into gymnastics coaching, where I really didn't plan on doing it, but that's where I ended up.
That's really crazy. I know in private conversation you told me that you'd torn your ACL. I didn't realize that it was not doing gymnastics, so you went through basically an elite level gymnastics career, national team. So as far as I know, never really hurt yourself that badly, and then hurt at skiing for the first time. So that's
actually I skipped out on a couple of things. That was actually the third torn ACL that I had.
Oh, okay. Wow. All right.
The first one I had was actually my first day at Stanford, my first turn. I got off the plane my freshman year. Went from New Jersey to California, went into the gym, and I blew out my knee my first day. So I kind of had not the most ideal start to my Stanford career. And then I tore it again leading up to Beijing, but I only had it repaired after I got back from China. So I ended up having two on my left and one on my right. But ACL, knee injuries were always the kind of crux of my career in terms of injuries. But the third one was the one that kind of took me back into coaching.
Yeah, I would say three is a lot, but I would never know it by watching you train. So obviously, you're a full-time coach now, and you spend most of your time coaching, general population adults, and you've also obviously in the past coached at Stanford. So what's really been the difference between coaching people at the elite collegiate level and even at the national team level, and then with just general population people kind of looking to use gymnastics as a vehicle more for fitness?
Yeah, it's actually a really interesting question. I've been fortunate enough to coach all different levels. I coach summer camps in the summers with little kids ranging from 6 to college age kids. Then I still have a position with USA Gymnastics where I'm the athlete representative, so I work quite a bit with Team USA and the national team and the Olympic teams and things like that. But to be honest with you, the thing that gets me most excited about coaching is actually working with people, like you mentioned, just the everyday average Joe that wants to learn body weight and gymnastics movements. And the reason for that is because I'm always looking for ways to build the sport of gymnastics. We've been forever in our sport trying to figure out how to get people who didn't grow up with it to see how incredible of a sport it is. And I feel like I have the ability to have the most impact in terms of the growth of the sport, bringing it to people that didn't grow up with it in the capacity that I'm doing right now. So even though these athletes that I'm working with on a regular basis are not, aspiring to be part of Olympic teams or collegiate programs, to me, this is some of the most satisfying coaching I've ever done because it's people that found it later in life but are truly passionate about it. They love the idea of becoming more body weight conscious and trying to learn a handstand that's more efficient. And to me, that's what it's all about. You don't know how many people have come up to me these days and say, God, I wish my parents had put me in gymnastics when I was younger, or I can't wait to put my kid in gymnastics now that I recognize how important of a foundation it is. And to me, that's the biggest impact, to be able to grow the sport through people that didn't grow up doing it.
That's really cool. And then, obviously, like when I watch you training with people over at Solace, I'm like, man, I wish I did this when I was younger. But can you articulate, I'm sure you could do it much better than me, what is it about gymnastics, not necessarily competitive gymnastics, but the movements that you teach that you think is unique relative to other types of fitness modalities, like whether it's, just powerlifting or, spin class? I mean, what is it that, is really cool and unique about gymnastics that maybe more people should want to do it?
I think a really good way to summarize it is actually the slogan that USA Gymnastics has. It's begin here, go anywhere. And essentially what that comes down to in my mind is the idea that gymnastics allows you to set a foundation for anything that you want to go on to do. If you can't move your body efficiently without external loads, there's no way that you can expect to do it once you have a barbell overhead or you have a bat in your hand or a golf club. It translates into everything else that you might want to do physically. And from my perspective, in the way that we coach with our Power Monkey teams and with our Monkey Method, which is our training program, we break it down into kind of 4 phases. And to me, the phase 1 is the most critical of the building blocks. And that comes down to this idea of creation of body shapes. And I break that down into 2 subcomponents, one being flexibility and mobility, being able to manipulate your body into the positions that we're requiring of it at a higher level. And then the secondary component is core work, core strength, being able to control what your midline is doing in all facets, not only what you can see in the mirror, not only your beach muscles, your abs, but along with that, your hip flexors, your obliques, your posterior chain. If you can incorporate mobility and core at a very high level and get to that phase of creation of a true body shape as it pertains to higher level movements, you can really go on to do so many other things. And so for me, that idea of setting gymnastics as your foundation, whether or not, a high level handstand or a planche or an iron cross is your end goal, it's going to facilitate a better learning curve for any other thing that you want to go on to do physically. So that's why I feel like it's such a great foundation for athletes who want to go on to do anything else physically. Yeah,
that's really cool. And then, just having watched you coach, I noticed that you're very meticulous about, your progressions, and people have to meet certain standards before they move on to the next thing. And it's kind of a balancing act, right? Because I'm sure a lot of people come to you and they say, like, I want to do a muscle up, but, you're the kind of person who would say, well, I want you to develop, the basic mobility prerequisites first, maybe even do something like a dip or a transition or even an iso hold in the rings. But most people don't have the patience to necessarily adhere to those standards and those progressions. So how do you kind of balance your, the systematic way that you've done things throughout your career, the safe and systematic way, with kind of the need to kind of keep people entertained and not be too monotonous for the general fitness population? It's really looking more for fitness and not necessarily to compete in gymnastics.
Right. Yeah, it's definitely it's a fine line. From one perspective, we have to preach the idea of technique being priority. It's the end all be all when it comes to understanding longevity within this and having people not just do something one time and then be satisfied and then something break down because they don't have the proper foundation. Instead, we want people to be able to have a foundation that allows them to do this 1, 2, 10 times, but then also 10, 20, 30 years down the line. So whenever I meet with a new client, I run them through an assessment to kind of get strengths and weaknesses, so we can kind of build a better training plan according to what their foundation already looks like. But I'm very clear right off the bat to make sure that they understand that the timelines that we're talking about when it comes to gymnastics movement are normally measured in years and sometimes decades, as opposed to days, weeks, and months, which is what they're generally looking for. So we have to kind of temper people's expectations. And that really is one of the hardest things to do as a coach, especially in the gymnastics world. But no matter what field you come from, it should be fairly obvious that there's no way that you can get to stage 10 if you don't have the prerequisites in place. You're not doing calculus before you understand how to add. You're not jumping steps. And the easier it is for you to relay that to the athlete and make sure that they understand that everything that we're doing from a foundational standpoint leading up to your end goal is going to have so many different benefits, the easier it is for them to start to accept the fact that the process that you're kind of building towards is the right one. So showing them slow progressions and being able to say, okay, look how much better this is. Even though we haven't reached your end goal yet, we've progressed so much within these other areas. It starts to get people on your side in terms of understanding the process.
Yeah, and then when you work with people who don't have a gymnastics background, so more like the adult general fitness population, what are some trends that you notice as far as deficiencies and things that you normally have to spend more time working on before people can move on to some of the advanced skills? And then I guess conversely, what have you noticed as far as people who tend to pick up this stuff more quickly? Do they have a certain kind of athletic background, or do you see certain trends? I guess kind of, good and bad with the people that you work with.
Probably the biggest deficiency that I see is mobility, especially in the upper back, shoulders, lats area, especially, guys that come from a world where they've been doing, weekend warrior type training programs, benching and doing powerlifting and those kind of backgrounds. It really has created an athlete that's very limited in terms of their mobility, which comes back to that phase one. It ends up kind of limiting their potential growth for higher level movement. So what we end up doing is spending a ton more time on stretching and making sure that they're capable from a movement perspective, and then build the strength component on top of that. I get a lot of people that are a little bit of a higher level from just base strength, and they kind of see a gymnast doing a planche or something and say, okay, I'm pretty strong. I've been working out for the past 10 years and I could probably do a planche within a couple of weeks. So I get a lot of that mentality, but the mobility piece is normally the biggest deficiency that I see with the everyday person coming in.
Okay. And then one thing I also notice is that, at least in your own training and even with your clients, whether someone's on the final rep of a set or the first rep, the technique doesn't really deviate. Now, I know there's kind of some motor learning purists in the audience who will say, well, the nervous system recruits different muscles and movement patterns to delay the onset of fatigue. But at least as far as the eye test is concerned, you're really strict about form, even in the fatigue state, and kind of cultivating that, I guess not deviating too much from those movement standards that you think maximize safety. So, and in the fitness world, a lot of times there's this mindset that if we grind through a set and train to absolute failure, as long as the bar is going overhead or we're completing a rep in the movement, the technique doesn't matter. We kind of pride ourselves on the harder we work, we can kind of forego the technique. But I would kind of argue that it almost takes more sort of discipline to be able to maintain that technique under fatigue. So is that something that you just kind of do naturally that's part of the culture of gymnastics, or is it something that you're very deliberate about in your methodology?
I think it's a little bit of both. I think you're exactly right in kind of how you're viewing it and how you might view my training sessions with athletes. I definitely put a premium on quality. I always kind of preach the mentality of quality over quantity. And you'll hear this quite a bit if you ever go into like a CrossFit gym. This idea of technique first and consistency and that intensity. It's very much said, but not always followed. That kind of progression. But it's something that I try to adhere to as much as possible. If the person doesn't have the technique, that's where we spend a lot of our time. We have to understand kind of what the body positions are supposed to look like, and from there we start to hit numbers. We start to get the body to understand the movement patterns so that eventually neurologically it just takes over and you don't have to be thinking about the 20 different cues that we worked up to at that point. Eventually, it works up to the point where we can build an intensity where you might be able to do it for duration and things like that. But for the most part, the everyday athlete who doesn't have years and years of gymnastics training under their belt, they're spending much more time on technique, which means you do a turn, you take as much rest as you need, and you come back when you're completely fresh. And for a lot of people watching a session of mine, there's a lot of sitting around. There's a lot of, time between turns because it takes so much physically, the physical output that I'm expecting once that green light is on and once you're actually on the apparatus, it requires a lot of rest time. It requires you to be fully recovered before you move into that next rep or that next set. So I definitely put a premium on technique, precision, understanding how every single part of your body reacts and needs to be working within the movement from your fingertips all the way down through your toes. And that's why I definitely spend much more time making sure that people are recovered, making sure that from set to set I ask them, how did that feel? What were you feeling was engaged? What can you kind of look for from turn to turn and how to make it better as opposed to just running them through and trying to make them, feel completely exhausted and fatigued by the end of the session. It's a different mentality, but definitely more of a gymnastics type of a mindset.
Right, and then can you talk about, just for a little context, back when you were training competitively, what kind of volumes were you doing in particular exercises to help develop those structural adaptations to allow you to do the more complex skills? I've heard, just anecdotally things like, elite level gymnasts doing like hundreds of pull-ups and body weight movements in a particular session, even things like calf raises, just to develop this sort of structural capacity to do the more advanced movements and develop that joint health. So, and some of those numbers I've heard are kind of, overwhelming when you hear it. So, are those like urban legends, or is it really that hardcore?
I'd say that we do a lot of reps of particular exercises that kind of help build our foundation, things like dips and push-ups. And the isometrics are a huge part of what we do. The pause, the tempo work, static positions are obviously a key component to gymnastics movements. But I think, as mentioned before, one of the missing pieces for most people's understanding is not only that volume on a day-to-day basis, but it's the consistency. We're doing these movements day in and day out, and that's how our bodies become conditioned to be able to do a planche, an iron cross, a Maltese, and our connective tissue is able to withstand such high intensity skills because every single day we're doing these movements for particular periods of time. So while on a day-to-day basis, I think maybe, the volume that you mentioned is not as high. I don't know if we're doing, 100 dips on a daily basis. There'll be days when we do that, but it has to do more with the consistency and the day in and day out kind of rigors of it as opposed to just kind of pounding the body on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah, and then, when you guys were at the national team, like, how were you regulating the volume and intensity? I know some coaches are like really methodical about how they plan things really far in advance, and they know that, 3 weeks from now they're going to be doing 85% of whatever and this many reps. And some coaches kind of go more by feel, and they'll ask the athlete, like, do you have it today or not? And then depending on how the athlete feels, that athlete will kind of like auto-regulate what goes on. So in your experience, is it a little bit of both, or, what do you tend to do with your athletes when it comes to that?
Yeah, to me, that's a really important and interesting question. And it was different from coach to coach, to be honest with you. And it's also different depending on where you are in your career as an athlete. So just taking from the perspective of me going through my kind of cycle as a gymnast, when I got to college, it was more about learning proper technique. It set kind of a foundation for movement while I was in my club leading up to that point. My initial college coach broke me down from a technical standpoint and helped build me back up so that I was prepared for the highest level of gymnastics capacity. My senior year, I had a new coach come in who ended up kind of taking me from a good collegiate gymnast to national team level. And he put a premium on volume, on numbers, and doing things so many times that your body ended up becoming accustomed to the particular movement, which took the mind out of it. We wanted, with that type of a training mentality, the idea was if we can take the mental side out of it by creating by doing so many numbers that your body just physically takes over and just knows what to do. When a pressure situation comes up and you have to raise your hand in front of 1,000 or 1,000,000 people, it doesn't matter. Your body just reacts. Your body just knows what to do. Now, that type of a training plan works really well for someone that's a little bit younger. It works really well for someone that's in college, that might be in their early 20s. But as you get a little bit older in the gymnastics world, those kind of numbers end up starting to deteriorate your body very, very quickly. And so when I moved to the Olympic Training Center and started to train under my last coach, who was a world champion himself, part of the Soviet Union teams, one of the greatest gymnasts of all time, he took me from a gymnast that was accustomed to getting prepared for competition by doing numbers to an athlete that was prepared to walk into an arena and just perform at the highest level through mental training. And we would still do a lot of, obviously the physical training, but his was more about getting your mindset to visualization techniques, take into account the mental side of training, because at that point we had to fine tune our training to the point where we didn't overdo it from a physical standpoint to break down, so that we were always prepared when competition settings came up. So to me, that answer has to do a lot with where you are physically within your competitive season, but also where you are physically in terms of your career. Younger athletes can withstand much higher volume than older athletes, and you need to be with a coach that understands that process. So I was fortunate enough that I had coaches along the way that really understood where I was as an athlete, and it allowed me to kind of maximize my potential within those given years.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So it sounds like, and this is a theme among other people I've talked to, that different coaching styles can work at different times, and it really just depends on where the athlete is and how he or she is going to respond. And it really, it's always as much an art as a science. You brought up the technical aspect, and obviously if you're getting recruited by Stanford to do gymnastics, you're already at a pretty high level. But you also mentioned that there is quite a bit of emphasis on altering your technique when you got there. So was that frustrating? I mean, it's a sport you've been in your whole life, and now someone's asking you to kind of modify your technique. Was it drastic or was it more subtle? Because I would imagine that for someone who was as habituated as you to doing things a certain way, and all those repetitions you accumulated as a youth athlete, is it pretty hard to make those changes?
Absolutely, 100%. It's one of the most frustrating and annoying things that you'll ever find in athletic training. But it's a big separator between being a good athlete and being a great athlete. Because a good athlete will take what they're given and the techniques that they've learned at a young age and say that they're sufficient, even if they aren't. And a great athlete will say, okay, if my technique is not correct yet, I'm willing to put in the time to work on those fine details to make sure that they're put into place properly so that once I get to the highest of high levels, I can actually make corrections at a much more proficient level. Now, I was in a situation where I had a foundation that was pretty good for my club gymnasts, my club coaches, but I had a lot of room for improvement. And looking back now, the injury that I sustained that first day at Stanford ended up being one of the biggest pluses for my career. And the reason for that is because I wasn't able to compete my freshman year, essentially. And my coach said, okay, during your rehabilitation, there's really going to be 3 things that we're going to focus on. You're going to improve your handstand. You're going to improve being upside down. You're going to improve your pommel horse circle, which is generally a weakness for Team USA, but also a weakness for our team at Stanford. And number 3 is you're going to get strong. You're going to become a very, very strong upper body gymnast, a ringman. And so I took that to heart, and I used my injury as an opportunity to become better in those weak areas. And so by the time I was ready to compete, I had become infinitely stronger than I would have if I didn't have the injury. My pommel horse became one of the best in the country, and my handstand is, to this day, still one of my absolute strengths. So It really has to do with the mentality of the athlete if they're willing to take that step back. But I guarantee you it's one of the more frustrating things you'll see an athlete have to do, where they've done something day in and day out for decades, and then we say, okay, you've done that incorrectly, let's take a step back. And they're either willing or not willing to do it. And that's a good litmus test as to whether or not that person is going to progress properly.
Yeah, that's really neat. And you also were talking about, just kind of the stress of competing in high level competition. So if you're talking about like, a high level NCAA meet or even Olympic trials, I mean, some of these skills you've practiced who knows how many times throughout the course of your life. And then you go into a routine where you're kind of under the microscope. Does it really change that much? I mean, or is it one of those things where you've done these movements so much and the limiting factor is just more your ability to execute on that day versus all the, like, in other words, that external pressure, does it really make a difference? Or is it one of those things where it's like, I'm going on the rings and a ring's a set of rings?
That comes from your training. And I, as honest I can possibly be, the mental side of it was a struggle for me for most of my career. I pride myself on my work ethic. I was not one of the most talented guys. I worked my ass off to be able to get to that highest level, and it didn't really come naturally for me. So, I would be training with guys that would learn skills in a day or two and sometimes in a turn or two, and it would take me sometimes years to learn these movements. And so I was kind of this gymnast that's constantly chipped away. Like, I'm going to take a baby step today, I'm going to take a baby step tomorrow, and eventually they'll start to snowball into something more significant. But where I struggled was with the mental side. I would work my ass off and get ready for a competition, and then I'd go in there and I would end up overthink things, and I'd be like, oh my God, the team is counting on me. I hope I don't mess this up. And that's the absolute worst thing that you can possibly do as an athlete, is to have that type of a mindset. So as much of the time, especially later in my career, as I mentioned, once I got to the training center, this became a much more of a focus as part of my training, working with sports psychologists and people that were, much more in tune with the mental side of it. I was able to slowly start to implement some training methods that allowed me to go into competition and allow my training to speak for itself. And I would just get in there and say, I've done this a million times. This pommel horse is exactly like the pommel horse that I train in every single day. Doesn't matter if there's cameras from all over the world filming this routine, everybody watching. It does not matter. Some of it has to do with how you're training in the gym, recreating pressure situations as much as possible. Putting yourself in those types of situations goes a long way, but it really comes down to you being mentally strong. And I guarantee you that's one of the biggest separators between reaching the highest level, Olympic medals, things like that, and athletes that are very talented but can't perform on demand.
Yeah, and what's interesting about your answer is sometimes like you can almost care too much to the point that it detracts from your performance. So you mentioned that working with a sports psychologist was really helpful. What particular things did you find the most useful to overcome those mental hurdles?
There were a few. I'd say in working with younger kids and even some of the collegiate guys and national teams guys, I try to kind of relay some of the things that I worked really well for me. I mentioned briefly one of those, but it was visualization techniques. And we would do this every single day after a workout. And I would visualize my routines in 3 different ways after every single practice. I would visualize my routine as if I was doing it in real time. So I'd walk over to the apparatus, I'd raise my hand as if I was saluting a judge for competition, I'd close my eyes, and then I would just run through the routine as if I was doing it. Close my eyes and just visualize the entire routine. Now, early on, when I was using this visualization technique, I would have a tendency to constantly see myself making mistakes. And that's one of the biggest deterrents for people doing visualization, because they have a tough time seeing the ideal or the perfect skill or lift or routine. They end up seeing the mistakes that they actually do when they're performing them. And this was tough for me to kind of get over for a long time. So I started implementing visualization technique number 2, which is basically imagining that you have a TiVo in your head and you have that remote control and you're going through the routine as is through your own viewpoint. And I would go through it in slow motion essentially. And I'd go through every single skill, and as I was going through, if I ended up making a mistake or seeing myself fall, I would pause it, rewind, and I would completely redo that skill again until I would do it perfectly. So it would allow me to make sure that I was running through the routine to the point where those mental errors were no longer part of that visualization. It took me a long time to be able to kind of get through it. but it had a huge impact in my ability to take advantage of visualization. And then the third one is I would visualize a routine from the judge's perspective or from an audience member's perspective and be able to see, okay, what is the judge going to see when I actually go out there and perform? And I would do the routine from that perspective as well. So regular perspective, real time, regular perspective, slow motion, and then regular judge's perspective. Those were how I would use the visualization techniques on a day-to-day basis, just to get more reps under my belt that were mental reps, not physical reps.
Yeah, and I think that you said something really important that I want to clarify so that everyone can hear it. So in other words, a lot of times these mental skills just kind of get thrown in as an add-on, and it's like, well, we're going to see the sports psychologist today, we're just checking that box, and then people work on it, once and then maybe don't touch it again till like the day of a competition. So what you're saying is you did this stuff every day. I mean, it was as ingrained in your routine as working on the rings and working on the pommel horse and working on the floor, like mental skills. It wasn't like a separate thing. It was a part of your process that you did consistently every day. So is that the gist of it?
Absolutely. And like I said, I think later in your career, for me, it became as important, if not more important, than the physical side. Because my body was capable of doing all these movements. I have done them so many times that they were physically capable. But the mental side is really a big separator. So that's one of the things I preach a lot to younger athletes or people new to this, is to become as in tune with the mental side as they are the physical side as early as possible, so that they become more accustomed to handling situations, no matter what might come up, comfortably and with ease. And our coaches would do some interesting things with us to kind of prepare us. I would get ready for a routine and prepare us for a hostile environment, going down to a country where we weren't looked at as people really didn't like us, and our coach would throw shoes at us while we were competing just to prepare us for anything that might come up. And it would be a huge distraction, but essentially it was, if you can handle these distractions, you'll be able to do it under any circumstance. So that mental side was such an important factor that I learned later on that I really wish I would have learned earlier.
Yeah, and then you mentioned that you didn't consider yourself the most naturally talented athlete, and then you also struggle with the mental side of things. Now, I think on a positive note, how do you think that impacted you as a coach? Because usually I tend to find that the best coaches are the ones who weren't the most gifted athletes, and they're a little bit more analytical like you were, and they're better able to articulate how to develop those skills because they learn so much from their own struggle. So have you found that to be the case with yourself as well?
Without a doubt. Being at the Olympic Training Center, you kind of see the best of the best. And, we used to go train with the Japanese team and the German team. I've seen the best of the best athletes. I've trained with the best of the best athletes in this sport. And, you definitely see the athletes that grew up super talented. And, you're a little bit envious of when you see talent at that level. But for me, having to break down movements and having to analyze every single aspect of particular skills allowed me to appreciate where mistakes end up happening. So when I have an athlete that starts from scratch and ends up, making errors, I'm able to analyze it in the same capacity that I was able to do it as an athlete, where I could say, okay, I was making that same mistake and here's how I was able to fix it. To be able to verbalize that really only comes about either through experience as a coach or through really looking inward as an athlete and being able to assess the difference between just doing it through repetition as opposed to doing it through making conscious decisions on those changes. So I completely agree with you that an athlete that reaches a high level that was not supremely talented is generally capable of relaying that information over to someone that, that is learning it for the first time much more easily. So I found that to be a huge strength coming into the coaching world.
Yeah, and then along the same lines, as a competitor, regardless of your natural talent level, you've got to look at everybody and say, I can beat this person, right? But at the same time, did you ever, when you in your training or when you were competing, just look at some of the guys you were competing against and be like, this guy is an absolute freak, and kind of, admire these people in awe at the same time that you're competing against them?
Yeah, absolutely. If you look at some of the guys competing today or when I was around, the mindset has to be whenever you're going at the competition that I'm going to win. And, if you look at any of the best of the best, athletes in any sport, there's always kind of this borderline of cockiness and confidence. And, you look at a Michael Jordan, you look at a Tiger Woods, all of them have something that an outside athlete might look at and say, God, he's so cocky. But it really is a mindset of, I dare you to try to beat me. And that comes from the hours in the gym. That comes from you being able to say, I've done everything I possibly can to prepare myself to just crush it out here on this given day. Now, I had to build towards that type of a mentality. And that's not to say that I always was the most talented guy or really had a shot to win every single competition I ever went into, but the mindset needs to be there. And I learned that from I like to tell people that I had kind of three people that I kind of used as mentors in my sport growing up. And one of them really taught me that part of building confidence at the ultimate level. And it's Blaine Wilson. If anybody's a gymnastics fan out there, they know who Blaine Wilson is. Blaine's a 3-time Olympian for USA. He's a 5-time national champion. He's an Olympic silver medalist. He's one of the gods within the USA gymnastics and world gymnastics scene. And Blaine would always go into competition with the mindset of, I dare you to beat me. I absolutely dare you. Like, no matter if he was the best guy out there or not, he just had the mindset that he was going to win. And it took me a long time to kind of build that type of confidence, but I looked at him and said, give me some tips. What are some things that you do to kind of allow that to be put into place? And he really helped me kind of bridge that gap between, training and then getting to the setting and really putting it into play.
Yeah, it's kind of a cool duality. Like, to me, one of the things that I enjoy the most about the Olympics is watching athletes from different sports collaborate and admire each other's performances. So, like, I remember watching Kevin Durant, take a selfie with Michael Phelps in the swimming locker room. And, Kevin Durant, I'm sure when he walks in the basketball court, is not afraid of anybody, and he's got the mindset that, like, I'm out here to dominate, nobody can beat me. But then he's in the stands cheering on Michael Phelps like a kid. So great athletes, as competitive as they are, and they could play hopscotch and it would turn out violent. They can also admire the greatness in other athletes. So that's the cool thing about sports, I suppose. Switching gears, so I think that if you and I had our way, gymnastics would be taught, even if people didn't want to compete, like, it would be something that would be taught in phys ed, So what you were mentioning before about, like, why people should get into gymnastics, I mean, you can substitute gymnastics for movement literacy. It's basically just giving people these requisite movement skills that, I would argue that almost every human being should have. It's what makes us human and allows us to enjoy so many things in our lives. So imagine that you and I in our, like, utopian world were tasked with revamping, phys ed in the United States. Like, is this something that, and I'm not talking about creating elite gymnasts, but can people get the benefit from this stuff? And can you scale it on a really, on a large level, like at the scholastic level in grade school and in high school, and cultivate some of these basic skills?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, to me, it's a fundamental part of growing up. I mean, I don't know how ingrained it is with younger generation right now, just the importance of being physically active. We had things like the presidential fitness test and things like that when I was growing up, and I'm sure you did it as well. And those kind of things were great starting points. And I don't know if even those things are in place anymore, but you're absolutely right in terms of the value that gymnastics and bodyweight movement have for a younger generation to be able to just move more proficiently and to be able to do their everyday daily tasks better. And to me, it's as important as the actual book learning. I think that every single day kids should be doing something physical, learning how to control their body on a higher level. And I think that gymnastics training is a natural fit for kind of assisting with that. But the idea of just being physically active and being a kid and not sitting in front of a screen and playing computer games and those things as much as we see today with this generation, I think it's absolutely critical for people to be able to do that, not only from just a health standpoint, but also from a capability standpoint for them to be able to function at a higher level as they become older.
Yeah, and you see these pictures on the internet of, like, a gym from the early 1900s, and it's got gymnastics rings hanging from the ceiling and kettlebells and pommel horses. And I don't know if that's somebody just photoshopping it to tease us, but it seems like at one point this stuff was emphasized, and it's like it's doable. It's not, it's not that difficult to actually to implement. So maybe that'll change when things get bad enough. But I guess that's for a different time that we can solve those problems. What do you think, for like the average, reasonably decently fit, person, are some realistic gymnastics milestones that they can achieve?
I think it's pretty wide ranging, and a lot of the people that I'm working with right now are doing things that are some pretty high level movements. So I think the basic one that I get a lot of is a handstand, and learning how to hold a proper handstand from a technical perspective, maybe walking on their hands, learning a press to handstand. There are a lot of things in the handstand kind of category that can be worked on for people of all ages. At the higher end of the spectrum, what we're seeing a lot of people want to learn, and that I definitely think are within reason to learn, no matter what your starting point is, are things like planches, like things like levers, and then further down the road, you'll start to see things like planches on rings, iron crosses, and potentially things like Malteses, which are a higher level version of a planche on rings. Those are generally the skills that I come across the most in terms of what people want to learn. Tons of handstand work, tons of ring work, tons of lever work, tons of things in those different categories. And I really think that as long as the training is consistent and the programming is correct, and if you set that foundation of proper mobility and core strength, I think all of those things are within reason, as long as you understand the timeline that goes along with it.
Sure. And then how can people in the audience learn more about you? You're available for coaching privately in New York City. You also do some group gymnastics classes at Solace, and then you also have a camp called Power Monkey. Can you elaborate on those things a little bit for the people who might not know about it?
Yeah, sure. So I do coach at Solace. I have my private sessions at Solace, New York, which is on 32nd between Madison and Park, New York City. I have regular classes there a couple days a week too, which normally sell out pretty quickly. We go over kind of a general gymnastics movement or skill every session. It's an hour class that normally happens Tuesday and Thursday night at 8 o'clock. Like I said, those sell out really, really quickly. So if you are in New York City and you want to attend one of those, I'd highly recommend signing up as early as possible as they allow. Along with that, my company, Power Monkey Fitness, we do a bunch of other things that kind of bring gymnastics to the masses as best we possibly can. In terms of being in-person training, we do weekend clinics where we travel around the world, me and some of my other coaches, and we do gymnastics and weightlifting training, basically breaking down foundational movements and going through a lot of these things that we discussed over the course of a weekend to give people some foundational understanding on how to set their kind of training in place. Our camp is something a little bit more unique. Our Power Monkey camp, we host that 2 times a year in Crossville, Tennessee at Flip Fest Gymnastics Camp, which is a kids gymnastics camp that 2 gymnastics Olympians, they're buddies of mine, they own that site. It's a 150-acre campus. We bring in about 50 coaches, staff, and guest athletes that are, absolute experts in their particular fields. And then we bring in 100 campers, so 150 people total. And we run it like an adult fitness camp. So you come in, you sleep in cabins, you wake up in the morning, we do sessions of training throughout the entire day. We have an amazing kitchen staff that makes 3 meals a day that have snacks and smoothie bar and all that kind of stuff for meals and stuff throughout the day. And then, you have available time to go down by the lake and go fishing and paddleboarding and 5-mile running trails through the woods. And it's really just an incredible location and setting and learning experience. We have our 7th one coming up in April. The last week in April, we just sold out. So if you're interested in attending, it'll have to be for the following one in October in the fall. For more information on that, you should just check out the website. It's just powermonkeycamp.com. And it really is just something completely unique. We have people from all over the world coming. We have about 30 international participants from about 15 different countries attending the next camp. And it really is something really special and unique. It has grown to the point that it even kind of goes beyond what I was anticipating when we initially kind of put it down to try to put together. So I'm really proud of that. It's grown into something so cool and unique that if you grew up doing camp when you were a kid and want to do something that's more in line on the fitness side with adults, I'd highly recommend checking it out.
That all sounds really cool, and you've been really generous with your time tonight, Dave. So thanks again, and I look forward to seeing you. Well, I'll see you at Solace, but hopefully the audience will track you on social media, and we'll put up all the appropriate links that you mentioned when we get the podcast online. So thanks again, and I'll talk to you soon, man.
Perfect. Thanks a lot, Doug. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Take care.